You're listening to Let's Talk Creation, the science podcast that's just for you, with Paul Gardner and Todd Wood.
Well, welcome back, everybody, to episode 3 of our new podcast, Let's Talk Creation, with me, Paul Garner.
And me, Todd Wood.
That's great, and it's good to be back with you again.
Yeah.
And this episode, we're going to do something that may be perhaps a bit more challenging for some of our listeners, because we want to dig into some of the scientific questions, and in particular, think about the methodology that we use to try and answer some of the really hard scientific questions that confront us as young Earth creationists. So, if you find this a little bit harder to follow than perhaps the first 2 episodes, hang in there. You won't find every episode perhaps quite as challenging as this one. And we're going to try and do our best, to bring it down to a level that everybody can understand. But it's important that we think about methodological questions, and we face lots of scientific challenges as young Earth creationists, and we want to know, how do we go about solving some of those challenges? And the approach that we both like is something that we call model building. We are interested in building scientific models, and so I guess we should begin there and say something about what a scientific model is.
Yeah.
Todd, do you want to talk us through that?
Yeah, let me give you a real quick rundown here. So, most of you probably can remember back to your learning about science in school, primary school or high school or whatever, and you learned that science starts out with observations. You then formulate a hypothesis. You test the hypothesis with experiments and more observations, and then it becomes a theory if it holds true. And then after you rigorously testing the theory, it'll become a law. And the sort of end product of science then is knowledge. It is, and that's the Latin scientia. That's what it means. It means knowledge. And so science is after truth. And we do it through this process of repeated observations that lead to more and more confidence in our assumptions, and then to truth. That is not really how science works, right? I mean, and it's strange to me that it has lasted so long, and that everybody seems to know this process of the scientific method, because it's not generally how science works. There's sort of, I guess, I like to think of it as sort of 2 kind of levels of science. There's sort of the high-level science that is model building, but then there's the low-level science where you sort of try to take ideas and apply them and test them, and that's where you sort of get this caricature of the scientific method. But a model is different from that. A model is sort of looking across big parts of science, big stuff, and trying to propose a way to explain a lot of information. A great example here that I think we can follow fairly consistently is the way that in the early modern period we went from thinking that the Earth was the center of the cosmos, or close to it, and that everything revolved around it, to our modern conception of the universe, where the Earth is a planet like the other planets in orbit around the sun. So the idea of planets orbiting the sun and the Earth orbiting the sun was fairly old. It was really sort of given new life by Copernicus in 1543, and a book where he basically said this might explain certain pieces of data. And some of that was, one of the observations that people had always made is that Venus and Mercury always appear in the sky very close to the sun, which was an odd thing if you thought that Venus and Mercury were orbiting the Earth. Why would it have to be always close to the sun? And Copernicus said, well, if they're planets orbiting the sun, then that would explain why you always see them close to the sun. And then later, but the mathematics of Copernicus' model were just as complicated as everybody else's mathematics. And it wasn't until the early 17th century that Kepler came along and said, the orbits of the planets are actually not perfectly circular. They're slightly off circular. They're elliptical. And this was pretty revolutionary at the time. And people began to, their math was much better. And so the model that they had, this mathematical description of how the heavens moved, became improved because they realized orbits aren't circular, orbits are elliptical. And then comes along Isaac Newton, who has this idea of gravity, and gravity then can suddenly explain why there are elliptical orbits, how the planets stay up there in orbit, how the Earth stays in orbit, and most surprisingly of all was that he gave an account of why there are tides, which is something no one ever really thought about. Why would tides be connected to the motion of the heavens? But it turns out the moon has a gravitational pull that pulls on water, and so it makes the tides. And so suddenly people realized that this model of the universe, which put the sun in the middle and put the rest of the planets, including the Earth, in orbit around it, this was more powerful. And so you have this gradual improvement, step by step, as the model gets more and more precise and more capable of explaining what we observe in the cosmos. And of course, later then we get Einstein coming along and fixing some of the issues that Newton had. But that's way complex. We don't need to talk about that. But yeah, so the idea there is that you're not just proposing one little hypothesis to explain some observation that you see, and that hypothesis comes out of nowhere. You're creating an explanation for basically everything that you observe in the night sky, right? Why are these things the way they are? Why do they do what they do? And that's what a model is all about. It's much bigger, and consequently, you argue for a model differently, and you argue against a model differently than you would argue against, say, a particular medical diagnosis. Is this person having a stroke, or is this person having a heart attack? There could be an argument about that, and different ways of treating, of course. But the idea that the heart pumps blood, or that the brain has blood vessels in it, that's sort of the model level stuff that no doctor would argue about, because that's silly. It's the same kind of thing here with the motion of the cosmos. So the way scientists actually think about things is vastly different than, I think, the way we're taught in school, and it has super important consequences for how we then approach, what if I think your model is wrong, and how do I address that?
So models are these kind of conceptual representations of very big and complex systems.
Precisely.
Now, one of the advantages, I think, of models, as you've pointed out, is that they help to explain lots of sort of disparate bits of information in a single conceptual framework. But they also help the scientific process, don't they? In that we can make predictions from models. So, we can say, look, if this model is correct, then I should be able to go out and do this experiment, or I should be able to go out and make this observation, and this is what the data should look like. And that's really powerful, because it gives us a means to then test our models.
Right.
Does it mean, Todd, that if we go out and test a model and we find a piece of data that doesn't fit our model, that we just throw the model out? Do we go, clearly my model is totally wrong,
No.
and I'm just going to dump my model?
No one does that. No one ever does that. So the arguments about the structure of the cosmos went on for a long time, there were advocates for the traditional view among the authors and scholars of the 17th century, as well as the new sort of Copernican heliocentric idea, the idea that the sun is in the middle of the cosmos. And they all had, and some of it arose just from the fact that there wasn't enough information. They just didn't know enough. And so the data could be interpreted in different ways. And so people were sort of left to a lot of other factors and persuasion. But yeah, if there were, and the same is true with Newton, right? So Newton had trouble explaining the orbital motion of Mercury, the details of the orbital motion of Mercury. And it wasn't until Einstein came along that we figured out what was going on with his model of how gravity worked. But that didn't stop anybody from saying, yeah, Newton's got it right. Even, there must be something funny with Mercury. We don't know what, but for the majority of the data, Newton's got it right. So no, you see inconsistent data all the time. Maybe it's fatal. Maybe it's not fatal.
Yeah. So models are really helpful in science because they kind of guide our research in helpful directions. They provide a kind of framework within which we make observations and interpret data. But they're also really malleable things. They change, and we can modify them, and we can make little tweaks here and there and adjustments. So actually models are quite hard to displace.
Yes.
Because you can always adapt your model, because what you're trying to do really is just approximate reality. I mean,
yes.
That's really what you're trying to do. You're looking at reality and saying, I want to understand this system. I want to understand what's going on. And so, you joked last time about bringing in a model airplane.
Yeah.
This time, but actually a model airplane, I mean, that's a simple representation
Absolutely.
of a real life object. And
the good ones can fly, right?
And the good ones can fly.
Put a little engine in there.
Yeah. So it's not the reality, but it's from a scientific perspective, it's good enough.
Yeah, it's a symbol. It's a thing you can tinker with and say, well, if this is true, what is this? And so it gives us stuff to do.
Yeah. Now, conventional scientists obviously develop models, but creationists are also interested in developing models. And I guess some people might have this question in their mind: why would we do that? Why would Christians, why would young Earth creationists invest time, because it takes a lot of time and hard work and money.
Yeah.
Why would we invest in building models? Isn't it presumptuous of us to try and develop models, to try to understand what God's works in nature? Is that somehow presumptuous? And also another question I guess that people might have is, why do that when we can just attack evolution? We can just kind of go out and show that evolution's not true, right? So why would we want to build our own models?
Right. And I've heard all of those kinds of questions before, especially sort of in our modern climate, especially maybe here in America, where people are kind of angry at scientists, and they're angry at lockdowns, and they're angry at climate change, and they don't want to hear about these stories that scientists make up. So why in the world would a Christian want to do that? Why would we want to, pretend like we know more than God and say what's going to happen in the future, or pretend like we know how the universe works or how whatever works? And, those are important questions, and I think one of the answers that I would give to that is there's an inherent call to this in the very notion of being God's representatives as his image and his stewards of this creation. It's really hard to be a good steward, a good caretaker of something that you don't understand. Just try to watch me babysit a room full of 3-year-olds. No idea how they work, What's going on in your head? Why are you behaving in this fashion? Just sit down and be quiet. I am helpless, right? I know nothing about these things. So I would be a terrible person to babysit, to be a babysitter of a room full of 3-year-olds. You would not want to leave me in charge. Most likely you would come back and I would be playing with them and we would be having a rollicking good time, and I would not be caring for them very well at all. But yeah, and so if we're going to be good stewards of creation, we really need to know what it's about. And since that was sort of our original pre-fall role, I don't see that that's been alleviated. And even maybe you might argue, creation has fallen, and so we're just going to endure it until Jesus comes back. It's still the work of God, right? And it still is in our charge as those who have dominion, those who practice stewardship.
And God is in the business of renovation, right?
He's
redeeming this cosmos.
Yes.
And we're partners with him.
Yes.
In redeeming the cosmos. So
yes.
In some sense. So, we can participate in that grand project.
Which is an amazing and exciting privilege. To be able to do that. But also, I would say to those who are worried about the arrogance of the whole process, you are right. There are things where scientists get way too excited and wrapped up in their ideas about whatever. And we do, as Christians, need to be very careful and humble. Say, this is what we know. And I know there's much more that we don't know than what we actually know. But I think that the answer is probably somewhere along this line over here. And be willing to be wrong. That's part and parcel of what science is. In the history of science over the past 2,000 years, nearly everything has been wrong. It's been discarded in some way as new models and new ideas come forward. So you just have to be aware that you're not here to sort of solve it all. It's not your responsibility to figure it all out. Nor is it your responsibility to make it to advocate a particular answer to everything. We are merely steps. We are steps in a process. We are cogs on a wheel, and we are participating with God, I think, in his activity here on the earth. And I think that when we do really good work in creationist model building, God is thrilled and excited. I mean, I would love it. I love it when my students figure things out on my tests and are able to answer hard questions. It delights me because, yeah, good. You figured that out. I have to think God is delighted when we realize, oh, this rock layer over here was not formed in this way. It was formed in this way. Totally different. Or something like that.
One of my favourite verses in the Bible is Psalm 111 and verse 2, which says, "Great are the works of the Lord, studied by all who delight in them."
Yeah.
And, we're called to do this, aren't we? It's the Westminster Catechism that talks about the chief end of man being to glorify God and to enjoy him forever.
Yes.
And, we're called to delight in the works of God's hands. And one of the ways we can do that is by studying them scientifically. Because I think, like me, you've found that science, yes, it can be lots of hard work, it can be frustrating at times, but it can also be enormous fun. It can just be an absolute delight to be thinking God's thoughts after him.
Yeah.
And in fact, as we kind of develop these scientific models, in effect, we're kind of working out in practice the confidence that we say we have in God's word. Because it's not that we're doing this science because we want to prove that the Bible's true, but it's because we have confidence that the Bible is true, that we believe it's going to help to guide our research in fruitful and productive directions.
Yeah.
I mean, surely, we won't get it right all the time.
Right.
But if we take notice of what God's word says and factor in the things that he's revealed to us in our scientific thinking, that's got to be better than just ignoring God and leaving him out of the equation altogether. So, model building is an expression, isn't it, of our confidence in the Bible.
I think so. Yeah. To me, that's exactly the kind of, if my understanding of Scripture is true, then that means that I should see this and this and this. And when someone tells me categorically there's absolutely no evidence for that, and it's sort of a conversation ender, and I think, well, how do you know?
Yeah.
What evidence have you looked at? And it makes me want to go dig into it myself and find out what's the deal here. You've been listening to Todd and Paul Talk Creation. If you'd like more information about any of the subjects discussed in the show, please visit us at coresci.org/podcast. That's coresci.org/podcast.
Do you have questions regarding the Young Age Creationism model? Well, we've got you covered with a book by podcast's own Paul Garner. His book, The New Creationism, was dubbed the single best book on creation and the flood by filmmakers of Is Genesis History. If you don't already have a copy, be sure to check it out on Amazon today. Now, let's get back to the podcast.
So that's all very helpful. I guess to make this a bit less abstract, we should probably talk about some specifics. And maybe think about an example of a scientific model. And
this is the part
creationist model building.
This is the part that might be a little difficult for everyone to follow, but I want to emphasize again. This podcast, this series that we're doing here, it's a journey. We're on together, hopefully. Please watch more. And future episodes are going to elaborate on a lot of the abstractions that we're about to talk about. So if this is way over your head, bear with us and please come back, because we're going to try to make it clearer and more understandable in future episodes. Yeah. So how about you tell us about plate tectonics, Paul?
Okay, well, plate tectonics I thought was a great example of a very successful scientific model in the conventional scientific community. So plate tectonics was really developed in the sort of 1960s, early 70s. There was a whole revolution that came about with discoveries on the ocean floor that kind of revolutionized our understanding of how the Earth works. And plate tectonics says that the crust of the Earth is divided up into this series of interlocking tectonic plates that move relative to one another. The idea is that our present arrangement of oceans and continents is the result of the breakup of a single supercontinent that once existed in the past. That the continental plates have moved apart by a process called seafloor spreading. And we don't want to get into the weeds of plate tectonics. That's not really the topic today. But one of the things about plate tectonics that is so impressive is how it explains so much geological data. So if you look at the coastline, say, of West Africa, and you look at the coastline of eastern South America, they kind of they lock together. You know, if you were to close up the Atlantic Ocean, the South Atlantic, they would join together like a jigsaw puzzle. And plate tectonics can explain why that is, because they were once united in a single supercontinent which has broken apart when the Atlantic Ocean opened up. We can look at the distribution of fossils or of mountain belts, and we see that they kind of match up on opposite sides of oceans. And we can look at the structure of the ocean floor, the fact that there's this great seam that runs down the middle of the Atlantic called the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. And there are a whole host of other things that plate tectonics helps to explain. So it's a really powerful theory, a really powerful model, and it's no surprise, therefore, that today virtually all geologists accept plate tectonics. I mean, it has, it is the reigning paradigm for understanding how our Earth works in the science of geology. So there's a good example of a scientific model. Why would creationists be interested in thinking about plate tectonics? Why would we be interested in doing some model building of our own in this area? Well, think about the problem here. We can actually measure rather accurately today the rate at which those plates are moving apart from one another. And they're moving apart really slowly today, at the rate that your fingernails grow. North America is moving away from Europe. So it's really slow. Yeah. It's very slow. So if we extrapolate that back in time, it would have taken millions of years for the Atlantic Ocean to open up. And of course, that's problematic if you're a young Earth creationist and you think that the world is about 6,000 years old and the flood was maybe, 4,500 years ago or something like that. So creationists have actually developed their own version of plate tectonics called catastrophic plate tectonics, in which the Earth's tectonic plates separated rapidly during Noah's flood. And again, not wanting to get into all of the details, insights from a number of different disciplines, studying the physics of the interior of the Earth and studies of the Earth's magnetic field and all kinds of other bits of data have come together so that we've been able to propose this kind of modified version of plate tectonics that is consistent with a creationist reconstruction of Earth history. And one of the really exciting things I think about this particular creationist model is that it explains all of the same data that the conventional theory of plate tectonics explains. So the jigsaw fit of the continents and the distribution of the mountain belts and all of those things are explained by this version of plate tectonics. But it also explains some other things that the conventional model of plate tectonics didn't explain well. So I think we can make a case that this is a more powerful model. This explains more data, and of course, as scientists, that's what we want to do. We want to try and explain as much of the data as possible within our explanatory framework, within our model. And catastrophic plate tectonics seems to be a very successful example of creationist model building. There are many others that we could look at, but this is really exciting, to me as a scientist, to be able to say, look, here's a model that actually explains more. That's the hallmark of a good scientific model in my book.
Okay, so plate tectonics sounds outlandish to me. It doesn't, but let's just say it does. It sounds outlandish. I mean, the continent's moving and rolling around. Why can't we just say that God made it this way and that plate tectonics people are just wrong, flat out wrong, and here's why you're wrong, bunch of reasons. Why go to the trouble of adopting this weird thing and remodeling it for flood geology or something? What's the point of that?
Well, I mean, that's a very good question. It kind of raises this whole question of, why should we be doing creation model building at all? Why don't we? We've already said that it's a huge amount of hard work. It involves lots of money and resources to do this kind of model building. So why don't we just focus our efforts on the weaknesses of the conventional views? Why don't we just attack evolution or attack, old Earth ideas? Why go to the bother of trying to come up with models of our own? I think there are a number of ways that we can kind of approach that question. I mean, one response, and maybe you have others, but one response might be that people will tend to cling on to the model that they have.
Yeah, that's it.
Even if it's flawed,
Yep.
Even if it doesn't answer all of the questions, it doesn't explain all of the data, until a better model comes along.
Yep.
you will just hang on to the model. You know, so if you go to somebody and you point out all the problems in their scientific model, and you say, look, I can poke all these holes in your model, they're going to say, okay, but what's the alternative? How do you explain it? What's the model that you can come up with that does a better job? And until you can come up with something that does a better job, I'm going to stick with this model and work away at this one.
That's right.
And I think we have a huge opportunity here as creationists to say our model can explain the data better.
Right. It's like, analogy I kind of like to use is, you're asking someone to move out of a leaky house that's about to fall down into no house at all. Well, okay, given the choices, I'm going to stick with the leaky house that's about to fall down and try to shore it up and keep it going, because I don't want to live in no house at all. That doesn't make any sense. So, I think you're on the right. I think you got it exactly right there. And the other reason that the other response I would give to that is that, the plate tectonics model is powerful. It really is. It explains an enormous amount of data, and it's very compelling. And so I can totally understand why a geologist would say, yeah, this is probably the history of the continental motion on the planet. And so for me, I'm looking at this going, all right, well, then how does that fit into what I think is the history of creation? And the thing about catastrophic plate tectonics that I like, it takes away the argument that there's no evidence for the flood, right? Because you're looking at it wrong. All of the evidence is the evidence for the flood. It's all evidence of the flood, everywhere.
Yeah.
Oh, right. Yeah. Suddenly things become much more powerful and intelligible, I think. Whereas before, if you're just saying there's some sort of layer where there's a global flood, that's not present. But catastrophic plate tectonics, suddenly, it makes sense. So to me, it's I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. There's probably something to this. It can't be so compelling and be utterly fallacious. There must be something to it that somehow resembles the truth.
And what's really interesting is that this actually helps to respond to another criticism that people often make of young Earth creationism, which is that they say to young Earth creationists, look, in order to be a young Earth creationist, you've just got to throw out modern science. 99% of the modern discoveries in biology and geology and astronomy, they just go out the window. And when you look at a model like catastrophic plate tectonics, you realize that's not true.
Right.
In fact, we've adopted 99% of conventional geological wisdom, the accumulated wisdom that has come up with plate tectonics. And what we've done is we've modified it in an interesting way. We've said, what happens if the rate at which plates are diving into the Earth's interior is faster than today? What happens? How does that unfold? And what we find is that by making that modification, we come up with a model that explains more of the data. So we haven't thrown out, vast swathes of geological knowledge here. We've adopted it and modified it in interesting ways.
Yeah.
And so often you find that this is what creationists are doing. And in effect, that's what we see happening even in conventional scientific model building. Einstein comes along, and Newton doesn't get thrown out wholesale. Newton is perfectly good for most things that we're dealing with here on the Earth. It just doesn't work on cosmic scales. Right. And Einstein came up with a kind of modified Newtonianism.
Right.
I mean, in effect, that's what it is. It builds on what Newton did. It doesn't completely throw it out and start from scratch.
Right, and he explains everything Newton does and then some. So it's not that Newton is wrong, and that's another weird feature of models, because it's not that the model is necessarily right or wrong. It's usually better or worse, right? There are better models, or good models, and there are not so good models, there are worse models. But to my mind, all models are wrong because we just don't know enough, right? We just don't know how they're wrong yet.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's another funny. We've rejected all of science, and I just think I don't know what you mean by that.
No.
Because I'm doing science. I'm out here, sequencing DNA, or I'm out, mapping rock layers or whatever. I'm not doing theology. I don't know what else it would be. So
yeah. So we've got these creationist models. We've got things like plate tectonics, and we've got baraminology, and we've got creationist models of the Ice Age, and all kinds of other things. So that means basically that we've got it all sewn up, right? So we've kind of worked it all out, and we've kind of got all the answers.
Yeah, I can retire now. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and the other side are completely, they've got it all wrong.
Yeah, no.
Is that how it is?
No, to me, the model building approach is really, if you want an approach that is intrinsically humble and really reflective of the way that Jesus taught us to live, then the model building approach is one way of doing that, because we're always finding out things that were wrong, and we're always learning new things. I think about, especially one of my research interests is fossil hominins and studying fossil humans and fossil apes. There's always new stuff being discovered, and new papers being published, and new research being done, and you're always having new things to think about, and new possibilities being presented. And so it forces me to be careful about how I present my research, how I talk about these things, because I could be wrong 2-3 years from now, or maybe tomorrow. Maybe there's a paper coming tomorrow that's going to show I was wrong about something. And that's great, and that's cool, because I don't think it's a danger to us or a flaw. I think it is inherent in the human condition. We don't know everything. We learn things, and we modify our understanding of things. And hopefully, in that process, we are approaching closer to the creator of all, right? The one who has set it all up, and by learning about his works, we learn about him. But yeah, the constant dynamics of model building just sort of necessitates you got to be humble, because you're probably wrong.
And it's important to recognize that although we have a commitment to the Bible, the Bible gives us an enormous amount of freedom to develop scientific models and to test them by the data, because the Bible kind of gives us, this broad outline of, Earth history, but it doesn't tell us the details.
No,
so
the details are all missing.
Yeah, and the details are, what are interesting to us often as scientists. So, for example, take fossils. We may well, by reading the scripture, come to the conclusion that fossils must post-date the fall of Adam, because there wasn't any death until Adam sinned. Sure. And fossils are dead things, right? So there's a biblical constraint for us.
Yeah.
But that's it. After that, when did the fossils form? Were they formed before the flood? Were they formed during the flood? Were they formed after the flood, or a combination of all three? The Bible doesn't tell us that.
No.
So then we have to go to the data, and we have to start kind of digging into the evidence and working out those things, within the constraints that the Bible gives us. But they're very broad constraints. And you could imagine that several different competing scientific models, many competing scientific models, would all be compatible with the biblical data. And then we have to do the hard work in terms of what does the evidence support, what does the scientific evidence tell us.
And I think the ambiguity, I guess, of Scripture, I think that's important because no one in this process then has sort of the moral high ground. I think unfortunately, a lot of us get way too attached to our models, and we start thinking this is God's truth. Yep. Maybe even that God revealed to me or something like that. And therefore, if you question this, you're suspect as a Christian, or maybe not a good creationist or something like that. That kind of stuff needs to just go, because the Bible allows for all sorts of things, and people pose all sorts of weird questions to me that I think, where do you get that? And it's mostly just revealing my own biases, my own unexamined assumptions about what the Bible is doing, what the Bible is telling me. And it's good for me to hear those kinds of things, because it keeps me humble and keeps me thinking, yeah, maybe I didn't get that right. So. Yeah.
Now, you and I have both been involved in this kind of creation model building work in various ways,
right?
And we understand, I think, how powerful model building can be and how exciting it can be. But there may be people out there listening to this who think, wow, that does sound exciting, but how do I get involved in this? What can I do? They may be perhaps a student, or perhaps a Christian young person thinking, what should I choose to study? Or even a regular church member who just thinks, how can I support what these guys are doing? What kind of advice would you give to someone thinking that way?
Lots of different things that can be done. Number one, we need prayer. We are, to say we're a minority is sort of an understatement. There are maybe dozens of us. There are thousands of sort of conventional scientists working on evolutionary problems and archaeology and geology and so forth. And there are maybe dozens of people working on creationist ideas. So we need a lot of prayer. You can choose to fund some of the work as well, even small donations. So our ministries are basically run by small donations from lots of people, and so that would be a way to do that. We also, the Core Academy has the Sanders Scholarship Fund, where we fund research projects conducted by young people who work with established creationist mentors who help them to learn the craft of doing good creation research. That might be another outlet you might want to look into as an investment in the kingdom. But if you're a young person, you should contact us or look into the show notes here, because there are plenty of opportunities where you can get involved, get an education, become a scientist, and start contributing to this great work. And if you're
there are disciplines where we need help, aren't there, Todd? I mean,
every discipline we need help.
Yeah, but there are some in particular where we don't really have any creationists. Yeah, and so there's a huge opportunity for young people if they're gifted in science and they want to get involved. I mean, the field is wide open, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. And then if you're beyond your education years, like me, and not interested in any more formal education, there are things that you can do to involve yourself in research as sort of a family vacation. And we'll have some examples of that in the show notes as well, where you can connect with people who are doing dinosaur digs, who are doing archaeological excavations, and other sorts of research projects like that, where you can just go and participate as you are able and help the scientists in their work. So
another thing that we have is our annual Origins Conference. Yes. Where the Creation Biology Society, the Creation Geology Society, and as of this year, the Creation Theology Society get together and report on the work that individuals are doing in this kind of area. And that would be a great place for students to come, wouldn't it? And to meet with key researchers and to hear what's going on at the cutting edge.
Yeah, and it might be a bit overwhelming for sort of lay people to come and hear, because it's usually quite technical. Even for me, sometimes I zone out during the geology talks, but true confession. But yeah, it's an astoundingly wonderful place to sort of sit down and talk with people and just ask the hardest questions you can think of, and find out that we don't know the answers either. and that we need to look into these kinds of things and conduct these sorts of research projects in order to learn more about God's creation.
And what about people who are perhaps in different disciplines? I mean, is there a need for people who are Bible scholars, linguists, historians, archaeologists?
Yeah, all of these disciplines we could use help in. Unfortunately, with so few of us, we end up wandering off into disciplines with which we are not familiar, and oftentimes not doing a very good job of it because we're just not that well versed in that area. So, yeah, if you have those kinds of skills and you think, how could I contribute? You should contact us. Send us emails, send us, or maybe come to the Origins Conference, and we can help plug you into the kinds of questions that are sort of pressing at the present, and maybe you can help contribute in that way.
And I think another thing that everybody could do, whether they're a scientist or not, is to just help to promote the work that Christians who are involved in this kind of work are doing. And one of the ways that you could do that is my book, The New Creationism, Building Scientific Models on a Biblical Foundation. I wrote that really as a kind of introduction for lay people to the kind of creation model building work that's going on. So it's a good introduction to model building, and it's the kind of book that you can pass on to others and maybe give to your pastor. Todd has written an excellent book called The Quest, exploring creation's hardest problems. Yeah. And that's great, particularly for students. I think they would find that very helpful. And a movie like Is Genesis History that kind of showcases the work of creationists in these various disciplines. Why not consider getting hold of that movie, showing it at your church, or getting it on DVD and sharing it with your friends, or as a download? There are all kinds of ways, aren't there, that people can help to just spread the word.
Yes.
So that people hear more about this kind of work. Yeah. Because I wrote The New Creationism because I just felt this kind of model building approach just wasn't being heard enough by the average person. We're there in the Origins Conference every year talking about these kinds of questions, but we need to be able to share it to everyday folk.
That's right. Yes, absolutely. Well, that was a good episode. Yeah. So, do we know what's coming up in the next episode? I don't think we've planned the next episode yet.
No.
We'll have to see how that goes.
So, do you want to do a kind of generic closeout?
Yeah, let's just do a generic closeout. Thanks for watching, everyone. Visit us on our social media accounts. We're on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Check out our ministries, Biblical Creation Trust and Core Academy of Science. That's biblicalcreationtrust.org and coresci.org. And if you want to interact with us, the easiest and simplest way might be to just go on to Facebook and send us some messages through other ministries or through the Let's Talk Creation page. And thanks for watching. Spread the word. And we'll see you next time.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. See you next time.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Let's Talk Creation. If you have questions, send them to podcast@coresci.org. That's podcast@coresci.org. And be sure to let your friends know about Let's Talk Creation. And check us out on social media. Thank you.